Greetings, this is Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me today. What I have to share with you comes from the Copper River Valley. This person wishes for their community to be left out. I'll just leave it at the Copper River Valley. It's a small community, and they don't want any strangers, whether they're from Alaska or not, bombarding their area, looking around. I'll respect that because it can happen. So they wanted to remain anonymous, so we'll call them Patrick and Tina. Patrick and Tina were on a walk near their home. They were about 4 miles into this walk, and as they're getting to the point of turning around, which wasn't far from the Copper River itself, they stopped and were having a backpack lunch that they had brought with them. They were both armed. They're both very bear wise and wood wise, and they believe in protecting themselves. So they were armed. They didn't specify what. They just mentioned they were armed. Tina also had bear spray. Now they found a little open area to enjoy their backpack lunch. And as they were sitting there eating, about halfway through, Tina needed to relieve herself. So she went just a short distance, easily within eye shot of Patrick, and was handling her business. And as she was finishing up, she said she heard whispers behind her. Really creeped her out. She jumped, ran back towards where Patrick was sitting. Patrick jumps up, of course, and was like, "What the hell?" And she commences telling him, "Hey, I heard whispers over there in the woods." Patrick was very upset because, of course, that's his wife, and, how dare someone be nearby and not announce themselves and start whispering about, his wife, doing her thing. So he starts looking around, and he's probing the area, and there's literally nothing around, no sign of anybody. And so he backs back over to where Tina is, and they have a short conversation about it. He said, "I don't see anything, and there's no sign of anybody. There's not even trails over there for someone to be." So they got a little spooked, and they weren't thinking hairy man or anything like that at the time. They were thinking maybe they were followed by some weirdo or something. Strange things happen in the woods. So they're basically, reasoning away, what it could be, trying to find whatever reason may have been for the whispering, because they were thrown off. Patrick, to this point, had not heard the whispering. So they decide to put their backpack lunch away and start heading back home. Well, along their way home, they have about 2.5 miles before they get to their nearest neighbor, because they're on a trail. So they start hiking back home with their backpacks on, and Patrick had Tina walk in front of him. They got less than 100 yards from where they were eating their lunch, and Patrick started hearing the whispering and started hearing branches break off to his left-hand side. Tina heard it at the same time, and they both stopped and turned in the direction of the noise and were looking at each other, being quiet, trying to listen to what was being said. The whispering they couldn't make out. They could tell it was close, but they couldn't make out what the whispering was. It was jarbled. It was like gibberish. They couldn't make it out. Nothing was enunciated. They really couldn't make it out other than gibberish and a whisper. So they stop, and they're watching that area for a minute, and they continue to hear movement just out of eyesight, and it gets a little louder, this gibberish sound. So they're like, what the hell? They get a little worried because there was an ominous feeling in the air once it got a little louder. At first, it was just curiosity on Patrick and Tina's part, but then once the whispering and the movement got louder, it took on an ominous tone, which freaked him out. Patrick said he clearly remembers the hair on his arm standing up because he was pointing in the direction he was hearing the sound, making sure Tina's eyes were on that direction, and he visibly saw the hair on his arm stand up when it got louder, which it just... Anyway, let me carry on here. So, from what Patrick was saying, Tina immediately was motioning him like, let's go, let's go. According to what she said, she got a very sickening feeling in her gut. So they start walking, and Patrick had drawn his firearm and had it at his side in his hand as they continued walking. Now, Tina did not. She had gotten out her bear spray, and they were walking along. And they were having a hard time focusing on the trail because as they were moving along, this whispering in the woods was pacing them at a distance just where they couldn't see. And it was really starting to bother them. So Patrick, after about another 20 yards of this whispering and pacing beside them, yells out, says, "Hey, stop following us. I have a gun. I will use it. Back off." It gets dead quiet. There's no animal noises around, and so they continue walking. And Patrick didn't want to announce he had a firearm for whatever reason. He just, he felt he was showing his cards, so to speak. If it was some weirdo in the woods, the weirdo would know, he's armed and potentially, it could get ugly or whatever. So, but what was done, he continues walking, and they hear this pacing, and it sounds like it's getting ahead of them off to their left-hand side. And Tina is verbalizing it as they're walking. She goes, "I can hear it. It's up. It's starting to get into front of us just out of eyesight." Now, they have a good mile on this trail before it starts opening up at all. It's fairly dense. There's not a lot of large, tall trees in this area, but it's a lot of black spruce, some pine, and, of course, willow and alder shrubs. And various other, things, ferns and what have you. And so it's dense. You're not going to see much, even if it's right up on you. And they're very concerned because they could hear this movement getting ahead of them. So they're concerned about, them potentially being ambushed. So they pause for just a moment, and Tina says, "We should jog." Patrick agrees, and they start trotting along. Now, they're carrying backpacks. They weren't overly heavy or anything like that, but the backpacks were making a lot of jingling and jumbling noises with the zippers and all that stuff. So they initially started jogging along the trail, but they weren't able to hear the surrounding noise because of all the noise they were making. So they stopped, they reassessed, and decided to walk at a fast pace without making as much jingling noises with their backpacks and stuff. Once they got their game plan, they continued on. Now, this whole time, the whispering, the gibberish sounds, and them being paced has not stopped. When they started running for the brief moments that they did, this movement beside them was consistent. They couldn't hear any like running or anything like that, but the sound itself was moving through the trees on pace with them, which really freaked them out. Now, once they after running, Tina she said about 25 yards into that, she stopped abruptly because she saw something very dark off to there. It would be if the trail they were on was 12 o'clock, it would have been at the 10 o'clock position, approximately 50 yards off to their left. She stops and assesses what she could see, and what she could see is this darkness in between these two trees. And at first she almost dismissed it because it looked like just a tree blowing, but there was no wind, and that's what caused her to focus on that one movement. Very dark. It was just at the right distance where they couldn't really make anything out, but just something big and dark moving between two trees, almost like a tree blowing back and forth in the wind. Now, from Patrick's perspective, he had to come up a couple paces to join Tina on the trail for her to point out, and then finally he got a fix on it and starts yelling again, "Hey, stop following us. Leave us alone before, this turns ugly." He's just yelling this stuff out. There's nothing in return. More whispers and gibberish a moment later after he was done talking. So they carry on. They continue down this trail, and Tina says she started feeling very, very ill to her stomach. She said that she felt like she was in imminent danger. Patrick, however, he didn't feel the same. He felt nervous, but he didn't feel like he was in imminent danger. So after a few paces of Tina feeling that way, she stops and tells Patrick, "Hey, I feel we're in serious danger." And Patrick didn't dismiss it. It's just he didn't have the same feeling. He was nervous and anxious, but he wasn't in fear of his life. So he said, "Just stay calm. We're armed. Let's be ready. Let's keep moving." They continue on. They went approximately, from that last little conversation, they went approximately 50 more yards, and there was no sound whatsoever as they were walking. After that 50-yard mark-ish, they were guesstimating, of course, all of a sudden they hear the whispering, and it sounds like it's just on the other side of the trees, just out of view, a lot closer than it had been the whole time, which immediately caused them to stop, and Patrick panic-fired about 3 rounds in that direction into the trees. Just bam, bam, bam. They heard scurrying in the brush, some branches breaking, and then the gibberish talk got louder and louder going away from them, and they heard other movement from nearby, not in that exact location where they heard the loudest whispers, but from various points, just a little ahead of them and a little off the trail. So they heard multiple movement. They couldn't tell if it was 2 or 3, but it was at least 2. Whatever they didn't have a visual yet, so at that moment they didn't know what it was, but whatever the 2 things were moving away. So with Patrick's ears ringing, and Tina's as well, these things were making enough noise to be heard moving away. Now they continue on down the trail, basically running at this point for they weren't quite sure, but they, from the adrenaline dump and the just everything going squirrely, it wasn't very far before they had to catch their breath, because they were already been holding their breath and freaking out the whole time. Now Patrick said one thing that stood out is once they took off running full bore, he said about half the distance that they were able to keep up a really fast pace. So about half that distance point, he started hearing thrashing in the brush off to their left, just behind them, and he was guesstimating about 60 yards back behind them off the trail. So once they stopped because they were out of breath and starting to really hyperventilate and freak out, he said they stopped, and he had Tina squat down, get her firearm out, and he stood guard over her, waiting for whatever to show itself. Because once they stopped, they heard the movement still moving towards them, but just out of sight. Patrick said that where they happened to have stopped was a very tight part of the trail, very, very dense on both sides, and damn near impossible to make anything out other than the noises. Couldn't see movement, it was just damn near impossible. So he whispers to Tina, we got a little ways to go before it starts opening up. Let's get into the open so we're not so closed in. And she agrees. They took a moment. She said, let me catch my breath. So they sat there for a moment, catching their breath. Meanwhile, that noise had stopped. The movement, anyway, of the noise had stopped, but the gibberish whispers continued. And he said at that point he could tell the whisper was coming in two different tones. So he would hear a weird gibberish whisper and then a response not too far away to the whisper. And he said it was very, very creepy. He had a very hard time staying focused. His head was on a swivel. A couple times he thought he heard movement behind them. And so they were feeling enclosed real fast, getting real claustrophobic on this tight trail. Finally, they take off again. Now, he says he doesn't remember how long it took for them to get to that where it opens up more on the trail. But they did not stop. They weren't full-blown running. They were kind of trotting along because he was head on a swivel trying to keep track of where the noises were coming from. And it was hard with the backpack noise and all that stuff. But they were motivated to move. Patrick said as soon as they came into that clearing, Tina was spent. And so was he damn near. They basically had been hyperventilating, like panic-stricken. He looked at Tina when they got into the clearing, when she turned around where he could see her face, outside of just profile now and then of her looking off the side of the trails. She was pale, and he was really concerned for her because she did not look good. She looked very pale, peaked, almost gray in tone. She was really getting freaked out, and so was he, just by the nature of what was happening. Now, they spent their whole lives in the woods. Understand, they are not just, weekend warriors that decided to go on a hike. This is their life. They've always been out in the woods, never had anything like this happen. They're, at the time, they're both late 40s, and this is the first time they had ever encountered anything like this ever in their life. They had been together for a long time, always hunted in the woods, berry picking, the whole nine. They were not wallflowers. So once they got to this clearing, Patrick said he had Tina stand behind him with her firearm out, and he had his out, and he heard the noises. Now, they're facing back on their back trail now, so the noise is coming from off to their right. He said that this clearing they were in was probably a 50-yard radius. And it was kind of egg-shaped, and they were kind of more towards the top of the egg if their trail out of there was the top of the egg. So they're further away from where they had started in this egg-shaped kind of opening, right? About 50 yards in diameter. He said that as they were standing there, and he had his pistol raised, and he was just kind of looking back and forth at the trees and stuff, the movement off to the right had stopped, and he didn't hear anything. But all of a sudden, he saw something peeking its head above some brush. And so he started focusing on it, trying to figure out what it was, because the shape of it was weird. He was trying to make out what it was. At first, he was like, is that a bear? What is that? He's getting Tina's attention, and she sees what he's seeing, and they're trying to assess what they're looking at. Well, as this dark thing that's all they could make out at that moment was kind of up and down behind this bush, Patrick decides he's gonna shoot around in the air. He tells Tina, plug your ear closest to me so it doesn't ring as loud. I'm gonna fire in the air. Tina says, don't do that. We don't know what it is. It didn't do anything last time. Save your ammo. And so He stands down, and he's just kind of standing there for a minute trying to assess what the hell to do. And as they're talking about backing out of there, they hear more movement. And they can't place where they're hearing it from, but it sounds real close. and they were distracted for the briefest moment off to their left. And in that brief moment, where this thing had been bobbing up and down to their right, it stood up. Patrick said that out of his peripheral, he saw this thing stand up, and it stood up not too far from at least a 12-foot black spruce. And he said this thing was damn near as tall as that and very, very wide. I asked him if he saw any kind of, whether it be facial features, eyes, whatever, and he said it was just dark, silhouetted. So they saw that, and immediately it got their attention. They were both looking in that direction, and as they started to try to figure out what the hell they were looking at, this thing dropped back down below the brush, and they heard it moving from the right towards their left, but keeping its distance inside the trees. So they start, just without even realizing it, backing away, going back down the trail. Now there's approximately, from what Patrick was saying, about 30 yards distance between where they saw this thing and where they were at. So they got to the top of this egg-shaped clearing where the trail continued, and they knew it wasn't too much further before it really opened up really wide, and would have plenty of field of view. So they decide they're going to bolt for it. So they turn around and haul ass. They get to the bigger opening, and from what Patrick said, as they were running that direction, they were motivated because they could feel in the ground bipedal footsteps behind them. He didn't know how close. He could feel it in the ground, and it was motivation. They could hear it, they could feel it, and they were just hauling ass. Now, when they get into the bigger, wider clearing, Patrick immediately turns around because he's already almost winded again and points the gun, and there's nothing behind them. They had been hearing this noise consistently since they took off running, and when he turned around, he was half expecting this thing to be right on top of him, and when he turned around, there was nothing there. So he's panting, he's panic-stricken, Tina's at his shoulder, she's got her firearm raised. There's nothing to be seen. Now, just inside the trees, they start hearing movement off to the right. As they're paying attention to that, all of a sudden, a couple pine cones get thrown at them. Not directly at them, but they landed right in their field of view, and they were consistently starting to fall down around them. Little pine cones being thrown. From how far, they weren't sure, because it had to have been a high arced way for them to be falling. So since they're in the wide open area now, they can back up without worrying about backing into trees or anything like that, because it was open. So they're steadily backing away. Patrick said when they got about 60, 70 yards from that tree line that they had just came out of into the bigger, wider opening, that's when this thing showed itself again. And when it showed itself, it went from their right to the left to the trail, just looking back their direction. He said that's when he was able to tell it had an ashen gray look, pitch black hair, couldn't make out the eyes or whether it had whites in its eyes or anything like that. Couldn't really make out too much facial feature other than the complexion of the skin was different from the blackness of the hair. He said he could see the same colored ashen gray throughout the body, the way the hair was. It wasn't like mange, but just like a human's hair, when it parts or whatever, you can see the skin underneath. It was in that context. He said they continued to walk backwards. This thing walked over to damn near the trail, but then cut back off into the trees. Now, as they were backing away, the pine cones eventually stopped at some point. He doesn't remember when, because they were trying to focus on this creature. He said they got a little further away and then turned around and started walking because they felt there was enough distance they would hear or see this thing coming, which they were regularly looking over their shoulders, but they wanted to create distance. They end up getting up back by where one of their neighbors were, and when they got to that driveway, they noticed their neighbor's truck wasn't home, and they knew that person lived alone and wouldn't be home, so they continued on walking. They ended up making it all the way home. No further incidents at that point. However, that night, Tina said that just as they were getting ready to go to bed, still reliving the moments that had happened earlier that day, off in the distance, they heard a air raid siren type scream that ended in a very high-pitched, almost whistle-like sound. And that was the last noise they had heard since then. I want to thank them for sharing. They didn't want it public at first, just because of the size of their community. And so I told them I would just leave it general as far as Copper River Valley and just leave it at that. And so finally they agreed, just for the public safety aspect. Now, they lived here their whole lives. Mid-late 40s, never had anything like that happen until this instance. They thought all the Bigfoot stuff, hairy man stuff they had heard over the years through the Copper River Valley was all trash, garbage. They didn't believe any of it until this day. I want to thank them. I want to thank them for being willing to let me share publicly. Also, don't forget Night Dreams coming up December 15th at 7 p.m. Pacific time, which is 6 p.m. Alaska time. You should have already seen the website and the YouTube channel on the intro of this video. And again, thank you to Patrick and Tina for sharing their experience near the Copper River. And we will catch you guys on the next one.